Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Roger H. Sublette, president of Union Institute University, and we're delighted to have all of you here this afternoon to celebrate our 50th anniversary, at least one of our celebrations, our 50th anniversary. Many of you know we have regional campuses in Vermont, in Brattleboro, Vermont, North Miami Beach, Florida, Los Angeles, and Sacramento. And we've had celebrations in each of those locations with the exception of Sacramento, and we're going to be celebrating with our Northern California faculty and students and staff in December at the San Francisco Mint, when one of our graduates is going to be talking about collection of gold coins. We thought it was really appropriate to end our 50th anniversary and our golden anniversary talking about gold and the importance of gold, particularly in Northern California. So welcome to Cincinnati and welcome to each of you. We're delighted to have you here. Today's event brings together 5 of almost 20 Union doctoral alumni who have served as presidents of numerous colleges and universities across the nation. This forum provides us with an opportunity to not only reflect on the American political, social, and cultural landscape in the context of which Union was founded in 1964, but also to look forward, just like Union's visionary founders, and imagine what American higher education will look like in the future. If you're not familiar with Union's history, we provided some information in the program, and we actually are in the final stages of editing one of the first histories written about Union, and we hope to have that history available very shortly. In the meantime, let me take you back to 1964 for a minute. Some of us remember 1964 well, some of us do not. But in 1964, the Civil Rights Act became law. Lyndon Johnson declared war on poverty. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. won the Nobel Peace Prize. Nelson Mandela was sentenced to life in prison in South Africa. Congress authorized the war against North Vietnam, leading to the student protest movement. And those of us who were in the draft age period in 1964, all of us remember our lottery number. James Meredith graduated from the University of Mississippi as the first African American to attend a segregated school. The Beatles arrived in the United States for the first time, and the first Ford Mustangs came off the assembly line in Michigan. It was during that era of change and transformation that Union was founded by visionary leaders who glimpsed the future, even understanding the role of technology before the internet was invented. At Union, we have watched, and we hope led, in many ways, as higher education evolved and changed in the last 50 years. Today, we will learn what American higher education might look like in the next 50 years or the next 10 years, and we'll discuss the challenges facing higher education. So let's get started. Allow me to introduce the panelists briefly, and there's more information about each of our presenters in your booklet. We are so honored by their presence, and we're excited to hear their insights and their predictions. Each will briefly address the audience, and then we will take questions from the floor. Of note is that 2 of our 5 guests, Dr. George Pruitt and Dr. Gary Wheeler, head 2 of the 6 regional accrediting agencies in the nation. I'm sure there will be questions about the role of accreditation in higher education, and I'm looking forward to that discussion. And I suspect that Union Institute and University is the only university in the nation that has 2 members of the graduating classes serving as executive directors of accrediting agencies. That is truly a real honor, and congratulations to Gary and George for your leadership. Today's moderator is George A. Pruitt, who earned his Ph.D. from Union in 1974. Dr. Pruitt is president of Thomas Edison State College in Trenton, New Jersey, and chair of the board of the Middle States Commission on Higher Education. He is the nation's longest-serving public college president. He is widely respected for leadership, earning the distinction as one of the most effective college presidents in the United States in a study of presidential leadership funded by the Exxon Education Foundation. George is also the past chair of the Board of Trustees at Union and served as a trustee for 23 years. He's seen a lot around Union, and he's seen a lot elsewhere. 34 years is a long time to serve as a college president, and I think there's only one other president in the country now who has served longer than George, and that's Norm Francis, who has served about 48 years, I think, as the president of Xavier University in New Orleans. So I don't know that George is going to equal that record, but he's established a pretty good record in New Jersey for presidents. We're also joined by Dr. Scott Miller, who earned his Ph.D. from Union in 1991. Dr. Miller serves as president of Bethany College in West Virginia and the Cochran Professor of Leadership Studies. His first presidency was at Lincoln Memorial University in Tennessee, followed by Wellesley College in Delaware. He is a known entrepreneurial president and is widely published, particularly with his President to President series. In addition, we have Dr. Mark Schulman, who earned his Ph.D. from Union in 1985. Dr. Schulman has headed several alternative colleges, including Saybrook University in San Francisco, Goddard College in Vermont, and Antioch University in Southern California. He just recently stepped down from his presidency at Saybrook to join Stevens Strategy, a higher education firm specializing in managing the process of strategic change in colleges, universities, and schools. Mark is also a recipient of a Distinguished Alumnus Award from Union Institute and University around 2002 or 2003. Joining us is also Judy E. Walters, who earned her Ph.D. from Union in 2006. Dr. Walters has had the distinct privilege of serving as president, and interim chancellor of 4 colleges within the California Community College system, mostly in the San Francisco Bay Area. In addition, Judy served as a commissioner of the Accrediting Commission for Community and Junior Colleges with the Western Association of Schools and Colleges. And last, Dr. Gary Wheeler, who earned his Ph.D. in 2007. Dr. Wheeler is President Emeritus of Glen Oaks Community College in Centerville, Michigan, where he served for 7 years. Prior to his leading Glen Oaks, he served as president of Gogebic Community College. Gary is the immediate past president of the Higher Learning Commission and one of the 2 commission members of the North Central Association of Colleges and Schools. This is a distinguished panel, and I look forward to their comments. I thank all of you for being here today. Thank you for your support of Union Institute and University. And Dr. Pruitt, I now turn the proceedings over to you.
Well, thank you, Roger, to my distinguished colleagues at the panel and our distinguished guests and friends, both from the Union and from around the region. I want to tell you first how honored and privileged I am to be a part of this celebration, to be a part of this panel and a part of this day. I also want to acknowledge 2 of my colleagues that are trustees of the Union Institute, in which I had the distinct pleasure of serving for a long time, and it's good to see you, gentlemen. I don't know if there are any of the other trustees that are here that I may not know, but well, I've got to meet you afterwards. Anyway, I'll see you after the thing. As Roger indicated, today's program is around the future of higher education, not around its past. What we're going to try to do today is to give you some reflections from some very distinguished leaders in higher education that are all rooted in the experience of this institution. My job is to try to set some context for the presentations that they are going to make. And so I am going to talk a little bit about history and how we got here today. We really want to have time at the end for questions and engagement from the audience, so we're going to try to leave our remarks to 10 minutes, and that's all hard for people in our line of work. It takes us 10 minutes to say good morning, but we're going to try to be disciplined on that today. So in the interest of time, I do want to talk a little bit about how we got where we are today as a nation and Union's role in it, and a little bit about higher education. Because of the time constraints, I'm going to leave things that from Adam and Eve, Genesis, and Darwin up to 1776 to you to do that in your spare time. But I do want to talk about higher education as a particular American experience and the reason why it takes such a special character in this country. One of the extraordinary things about the American experiment was that for the first time, this country was attempting to create a nation that was owned by its citizens, where we were citizens and not subjects, where the people of this country were to hire and hold accountable the people that were to lead it. And that had never been tried before. And the brilliant people that conceived and organized this country understood that that was a pretty awesome responsibility, and they were worried about the ability of essentially uneducated, semi-literate farmers and industrial workers to be able to manage that responsibility. And one of the defining characteristics of this country, which we often lose sight of, was that this was the first country, certainly in Western civilization, that embraced the aspiration of universal education. And that aspiration was embraced and most articulated by Jefferson in the notion that he wanted to prepare the citizens of this country to conduct and carry out the responsibilities of citizenship. One of the three things that's on Jefferson's epitaph, which he penned for himself, was that he was proud of his founding of the University of Virginia. From the founding of early days of the colonies in Boston with Harvard and Virginia with William and Mary, there was an acknowledgement and recognition of the importance of education and higher education. The traditional pattern of higher education for the cultural and economic elite was kind of embraced by this country as well, and certainly in the traditions of private higher education. But what was different was the notion that there needed to be other kinds of higher education for the masses. If you're going to have a country that embraces the concept of universal education, you need teachers. And so the normal schools were developed to train teachers. In the middle of the Civil War, the Morrill Act was passed so that higher education and the methods of scientific research could support the agricultural economy of the country. After World War II, the GI Bill was passed to open up opportunities for returning men and women. And we became the only country in the world that extended the notion of universal access to higher education to all of its citizens. Following the Sputnik scare of the 1950s, there was an explosion in investment in education, and some of us went to college on something called the National Defense Education Act programs. And it was described that it was in the national security, and for the first, to be able to promote universal access for qualified people to go into higher education. So for the first time, the United States government federally funded financial aid to empower people to remove financial barriers to be able to go to college. By the middle 60s and 70s, the issue about universal access to higher education was the predominant theme in American higher education. And higher education exploded. The entire community college movement was created and funded and built into the country. Most of the large public systems of higher education in the country were founded and started in the 60s. It was a period of explosive growth and questioning and reconceptualizing the model of for whom higher education was for, what was the public benefit as opposed to the personal benefit, and how it was to be financed and paid for. And it was in that context of creativity that, among other things, 10 college presidents came together to talk about how to reconceptualize education, and most specifically, how to reconceptualize graduate and doctoral education. Certainly went beyond that, but that was the focus of that experiment. So what does it look like, and how has the environment changed, and what is the context that we find ourselves in today? Well, it is very, very different. Wherein the 60s through the 70s and even into the middle 80s, this country engaged in the largest investment in higher education in its history. In the last 15 to 20 years, we have been involved in the largest disinvestment in the history of higher education in America. Wherein the previous period where this institution was founded, we were trying to re-examine the quality assurance framework, the regulatory framework, to increase and enhance and support innovation. Today, we're involved in the biggest regulatory fights of our career from a federal government that is overreaching, intrusive, and more interested in compliance than quality. I'll certainly own comments for that for myself. I don't want to attribute that to others, but I'm absolutely convinced that's the reality in Washington today. I must tell you, it is personally disappointing. I'm a black guy from Chicago. I want to be a cheerleader for this administration. But I have spent the last 3 or 4 years in Washington fighting regulation that is not only intrusive, but in some, and destructive, but, well, I won't go on. I think you get the idea. Higher education today is under siege. We don't know what to do with proprietary higher education. That's a fairly recent event. The fact of the matter, it is not a recent event. Proprietary colleges have been around for a very, very long time. But the recent advent of technology has had an explosion in certain kinds of proprietary institutions, and there have been abuses within that sector, and we don't know how to respond to it from a policy point of view, from a regulatory point of view, and part of the challenge that we are dealing with a regulatory environment is a government that's trying to figure out how to control the proprietaries and is doing things that's about to throw the baby out with the bathwater. Costs are out of control, or at least perceived to be out of control. Affordability is a challenge for everyday Americans, and the higher education waters are troubled. At the same time that we have that environment nationally, internationally, other countries have looked at the American experiment, saw the benefit of it, and they are embracing it. And so now you're looking at extraordinary centers of innovation in higher education in Asia, in Europe, in the subcontinent, in South America, while we are in decline. The President of the United States called for us to be #1 in higher education attainment, which we used to be. The data is conflicting on where we are now, but the data that I think is most credible shows us we've gone from #1 to number 17, and we're still going in the wrong direction. It is true today, as it was in 1776, that the future of this country as an experiment is dependent upon the quality of our human capital, and higher education remains the most important vehicle we have for developing that capital. But how shall we go forward in an environment that's obsessed with compliance, that's committed to a concept of disinvestment, where our competitive environment in the world is going backwards? I was on a commission that came together to look at how do we become #1 again. And the data is frightening. There's I'm blocking on Dr. Carnival's last name. You guys might help me. He's a famous labor economist in Washington. He put out some data that right now, without growing at all, without looking at the future, right now as we sit here in 2014, there's approximately 3 million person deficit in the requirements of American economy right now and the number of qualified graduates that we're producing from our colleges and universities. When we published our report, and we talked about things that will be familiar to the union, we talked about things like promoting adult learners, promoting prior learning assessment, promoting flexible and new models to support innovation to remove access barriers. When we wrote the report, and this was signed off on and chaired by 43 college presidents of every shape and kind, calling for the country to support innovation, there was a line in the report that I put in that was taken out, and it should have been taken out because it would have been inflammatory and it would have diverted attention from the discussion of the report. But the line that I put in was that the principal impediment that this country faced in achieving the president's objective was the regulatory culture of the president's own Department of Education. So the challenge we have is how do we rebuild the consensus that we used to have? How do we get the public to understand that the future, that if we're going to have the kind of future that we need to have in this country to compete in a world environment? South Korea, by the way, is #1 in higher ed attainment in the world. How do we reestablish the consistency that we had in 1954 when Sputnik scared everybody that the Russians were smarter than we are? How do we reestablish that? Part of that dialogue is going to have to be led by people in the higher education community, from people like my colleagues, and to make me have examples of institutions like this one. So it's a kind of a broad brush. It's a complicated environment. The seas are stormy, and we have some very talented leaders here to talk about it, each from their own individual perspective. I'm going to try to gently keep us to 10 minutes. I'm now 29 seconds over, so I'm going to shut up now and turn it over to our colleagues. And we hope we have a stimulating conversation. We want to have a dialogue with you. We're going to carve out the time to do that. we're going to come to you without introductions and in the order to which we've been introduced. Neil, I think you're up next. Thank you.
Thanks, Roger, and thanks, George. George reminded us at lunch that if he makes it until December the 1st, it'll be 32 years as president at Thomas Edison. I'm glad you didn't say anything inflammatory in your comments that might attract media attention and you go the route of some of our colleagues. As the Union Institute celebrates 50 years, and as we in this forum look to the next 50 years of higher education, I'd like to take a minute to look back at my 28-year connection to Union and my 24 years as a college president. 28 years ago, I was an aspiring college president, but needed an earned doctorate to fulfill my career aspiration. At that time, I couldn't find many reputable, accredited programs that would allow me to work, enjoy my family, and pursue a terminal degree. Most required an extensive residency requirement. Noted presidential scholar James L. Fisher, who was on the faculty at the Union at the time, led me to the Union, and I doubt that I would have been named to a college presidency at the young age of 31 without that Union degree, so I'm forever thankful for that. During the past 25 years, non-traditional delivery systems have significantly altered American higher education. I recently reviewed a list of colleges and universities with alternative residency requirements. In 1986, I could count them using both of my hands. Now there are so many that you need volumes in order to count them. I can only imagine where this will be in 25 years, let alone 50 years. But if recent experiences have taught us anything, it's that adaptability to student convenience will continue to drive much of our strategic planning. These are challenging times for American higher education. Demographic changes, rising costs, new technologies, and increased competition are forcing us to develop strategies to leverage opportunities. Nearly a year ago, I wrote in the Huffington Post that campus life as we know it is beginning to change radically. The trends heralding that change are already here. If anything, they're now accelerating to such an extent that for us to address today what American higher education will look like in 50 years is tantamount to predicting the future of our society itself. After nearly 24 years in the higher education presidency, I've never seen such ferocious competition among colleges and universities, such high degrees of expectations by our student consumers, and such exacting demands for affordability, accessibility, and accountability. The trends I have noted in the past 5 years, let alone those I anticipate in 50, are suggestive of an inevitable wholesale redefinition of the concept of colleges and universities as we know them. And that, I think, is not necessarily bad. Whether campuses are public or private, 2-year or 4-year, residential or commuter, the changes impacting higher education are inevitable and in many cases unforgiving. What remains for us as higher education leaders is to decide how to respond to them, and we hope to benefit from them. We can choose to be frightened or invigorated, and I prefer the latter, though I also acknowledge that uncertainties surround the former. Here's my view. First, technology will help to redefine, if not remake entirely, the campus of the future. In our classrooms, laboratories, and libraries, students will have a greater role in driving the curriculum, filtering knowledge and course requirements through technology, and interacting with their counterparts in other nations in real time via Skype and other smart classroom innovations. Updated, of course, for the mid-21st century. Traditional examination formats will rely less on regurgitation of knowledge and more on regeneration of it. Because their future employers will expect a high degree of creative problem-solving skills, those students who can refine, reinvent, or redirect ways of using conventional information and knowledge-based skills will garner the most exciting entry-level positions, and the greatest entrepreneurial advantage for many, if not most, will be incorporated as companies unto themselves. Second, simultaneously, traditional academic department structures will also be redefined. Interdepartmental course offerings, collaboration on global study abroad and other initiatives, and the pairing of once separate disciplines will form a new academic model, a model critical to the existence of almost all the institutions that remain. This model will demand collaboration with other institutions and especially non-higher education partners as budgets and resources continue to shrink and student demands and concerns about institutional competitiveness and relevance inevitably increase. As our colleague Gordon Gee of West Virginia University comments, once it was a matter of publish or perish, now it's partner or perish. His words will continue to resonate in this century. Third, student services will be unrecognizable even by today's student-centered standards. More focus on personal wellness, safety and security, career advising and placement, leadership development, acceptability, and direct support for the growing ranks of non-traditional students will drive institutional priorities and budgets. What began as service learning nearly a generation ago will encompass new concepts of social leadership and advocacy, philanthropy, and engaged citizenship as new paradigms of community emerge. Technology will drive social and ethical perceptions while opening up new employment opportunities to address the intricate societal and security challenges of the mid-21st century. Because of the reality of terrorism and cybercrime, which are here to stay, our campuses will be fortresses of institutional and intellectual weaponry, while the constant threat of litigation over unsatisfactory grades, graduations, faculty appointments, and amenities will require in-house legal services adjacent to the offices of campus security. Fourth, all of this will intensify the competition that already exists among colleges and universities, though somewhat on a reduced scale, because various institutions that do not change or adapt well to change will continue to go out of business. Those that are strong, adaptable, innovative, and for want of a better word, gutsy, will find like-minded company as they establish regional centers of educational specialization and excellence, absorbing some formerly comprehensive independent campuses and finding ways to flourish in a mix of residential, international, research-oriented, and technologically interactive learning experiences. The goal of those experiences will be guaranteed employment, personal security, and social status, along with measurable contributions through research to humankind's age-old enemies. The equation must balance. There will be no variables because only those institutions providing the guarantees I just mentioned will be around to teach. Instead of providing attractive viewbooks and websites, cheerful admissions tour guides, and campus visitation days, they'll be expected to offer the coming technological version of a contract for services to be rendered. I'm sure that soon there will be an app for that. Fifth, I think the role of faculty that's been changing and will continue to change in the coming years. Reports abound of colleges wanting increased productivity from faculty. A number of my peers at private colleges are talking about increasing teaching loads, as well as expanding mini-term, summer program, and online offerings. Most say that a new trend is heavier teaching and advising loads and less voicing governance. Due to the Federal Age and Discrimination Employment Act, colleges are no longer permitted to set mandatory retirement age. As a result, faculty are teaching further into their 70s, and we have fewer spots for younger faculty. Older faculty traditionally teach lighter loads, meaning that colleges are using more adjuncts to meet load needs. Today, most private colleges are hiring instructor or assistant professor faculty members at around age 30. Those are freshly minted Ph.D.s or ABDs. Tenure at most colleges is a 6th or 7th year proposition. This means that essentially tenure is a 40-plus year contract now. In some disciplines, we have 8 to 10 graduating Ph.D.s with every available position in American higher education. Sixth, student services, compliance, and advancement are becoming the largest and fastest growing areas at many colleges. My own Bethany College was cited in a Chronicle of Higher Education feature because we nearly doubled our expenditures for student services. Over the years, colleges have increased services to students to increase enrollment. This leads to increased cost. Students are now expecting food courts, expanded dining services at multiple locations, climbing walls, turfed and lighted intramural and club sports fields, suite-style apartments, 24-hour libraries, and Starbucks. Compared to my first year as a college president, I can also say they require more student health center needs, including increased counseling services. To keep pace, colleges must increase revenue. Every day I'm reading about a $1 billion campaign somewhere. Competition for the dollar is intense, and additional staff is needed to cultivate and solicit. My perception is that institutions are less concerned about the cost to raise a dollar than they are with their overall publicly announced campaign dollar goals. State and federal authorities are pressing colleges to control cost, yet at the same time are creating additional levels of costly compliance. Hartwick College in New York tracked the issue for an entire year, and the costs of federal, state, NCAA, accreditor, and other forms of compliance were staggering. My own college spent nearly $300,000 last year on compliance-related items. Seventh, George Keller once said that small private colleges needed to have endowments of $100 million or a critical enrollment mass of 1,000. I suggest that because of the factors mentioned, that figure has moved to $150 million in endowment or a critical mass of 1,500. Government support is flat and declining. Fundraising is recovering from two significant economic downturns. Endowments have taken a hit. Colleges are borrowing more money. And for at-risk colleges, the bubble will burst and we'll have a number of acquisitions, mergers, branch centers, and other variations on the traditional residential model. Such changes may not take 50 years to come into being. Many are here or almost here now. Others will be evident in a generation or less. What I do not see, however, is a loss of respectability for American higher education. I believe that our institutions will continue to be intellectually relevant, socially beneficial, and economically vital engines of human life, commerce, and yes, security. If anything, our colleges and universities, in whatever form they appear in 50 years, will remain the best single investment of our national attention, resources, and reverence. More will be expected of us than ever before, and in that lie our greatest continuing prospects for survival and relevance. Next up, Judy Walters. Thank you.
Good afternoon. I am delighted to be among this group of esteemed colleagues, a community college person from California, probably the only one in the room from California other than my friend here, Scott. But in community, are there any community colleges people here? Go, sister. I'm a first-generation college graduate. My father managed to make it through the 3rd grade, and my mother graduated from the 8th grade. I have a Ph.D. from Union Institute University, which was the greatest experience of my life, to be able to work towards being a college president, get that degree, and continue my career in what we consider higher education in California. I'd like to start out by saying the continuing transition of education. We are teaching people to enter professions that have not yet been created and preparing them for technology that has not yet been invented. I don't know about you, but I'm close to Silicon Valley, and we cannot keep up with the changes that are coming in technology in all the various fields. To try to think what's going to be out there 50 years from now is almost mind-boggling. Can you imagine bringing back the inventor of the telephone, Alexander Graham Bell, and putting an iPhone in his hand? I think it would be an interesting experience. I think one of the things, listening to Scott talk, is that we have to convince corporate America that it is in their best interest to work to level the economic playing field, and that's done by creating choices for people through education. Changing the face of American higher education means acknowledging the changing demographics of our student populations, of our administration teams, faculty, and the U.S. today is a mirror of the world's population. Every person employed in any educational institution is an educator, because it takes all of us to reach the goal and vision of creating an educated global citizen in today's world. Community colleges serve a very diverse population, diverse not only in race, but in religion, thoughts, ideas, lifestyle, educational background, economic background, and values. California community colleges pride themselves that they are the actualization of the finest social public policy ever crafted, and it did come out of the 60s. Anybody can attend a California community college. The statewide change in student demographics, I'm only giving California and very briefly, but in 1992 to 93, about 7%, this is statewide, of our students, 2.2 million, actually 2,262,484 students, compared to 2,283,217 students in 13-14. African American students made up about 7%. I grouped Asian, Pacific Islanders, and Filipino students in one lump. In 92-93, they were about 15%. They are now 14%. Hispanic students were at 20%, and in 13-14, they are at 40% in community college students. White non-Hispanic were at 51% in 92-93, and 13-14, they are at 29%. Unknown or multi-ethnic grew from 6% up to 9%. More and more of our students are claiming multi-ethnic as a background. And we have more veterans that are attending our community colleges and more international students and non-resident students that are attending in California. Now, if you're a resident of California, it only costs you $46 a credit unit. If you're a non-resident or an international student, you pay somewhere between $175 and $180 per credit unit. I have eliminated the 40 pages from my speech about the history of the California Community College students, but if any of you are interested, I'm happy to share that with you. We have lots of regulations. We've always had regulations. We have 3 statewide systems, the UC, the CSU, community colleges, and then we have adult education floating out there. There are a couple of books that might be of interest for you. One of them is American Nations, A History of the 11 Rival Regional Cultures of North America. It's a Colin Woodward 2011 book. The other one is The Geopolitics of Emotion, How Cultures of Fear, Humiliation, and Hope are Reshaping the World. I'm a person of hope. Perhaps the most obvious thing to say about the changing face of American higher education is to learn to live with change and ambiguity. Go with the flow, we say, or surf the waves of change in California. But I invite you to be a part of the change. This includes building collaborations and key networks, co-creating the future, establishing partnerships among other 4-year, 2-year high school institutions and with our local businesses in the very broad sense of the definition. Dual enrollments, community colleges and high schools, articulation agreements. Community colleges are comprehensive in California, and we have worked with our faculty colleagues at CSU and UC in the late 80s to create the intersegmental general education transfer courses so that students would know coming in what courses they can take and where it's going to take them. And I think that's going to accelerate. I think community colleges are going to grow. I think there are going to be more certificate programs and more community colleges throughout the United States, and that we're going to need to build those connections so that students have pathways in terms of reaching their goals. We do a number of things, not only with the articulation agreements, but we hold transfer days inviting colleges to come on our campuses. We go to high schools, we go to churches, we go to community events, especially in the Hispanic and Asian communities that we have, to be able to bring our students in to the possibilities of getting an education and the choices they would have with that. Some of the leadership essentials that I work with, and I have a broad definition for this, about discovery, which consists of seeing what everybody else has seen and thinking what nobody has thought. How can you make the connections? I believe in multiple truths and multiple realities. It is a new world. We are preparing people to live in a global community. We are educating global citizens. Many languages and mixing of cultures which affect many values. We need to learn to collaborate or co-create our solutions, discover the connections, and remember to stay student-centered. I think faculty, students, and our administrators working together to help create the new areas that you heard Scott talk about. I've always worked in a system that has pluses and minuses, but since that's what I've worked in, then I've learned how to work within it. So I use the positive side. Over the course of my career, I've used positive methodology called appreciative inquiry, which was part of my doctoral work at Union Institute, to determine and capitalize on the strengths of my team. I've worked with groups and administrators in interactive mini-queries, such as discovering and building on our strengths, help us identify values related to how we would work together, what those are to carry them forward. Maximum inclusion focused on the strengths and successes that each individual brought to a diverse management team so that we could build on those strengths and work together in positive ways. Remember, when I talk about diverse, I'm not only talking about color, I'm talking about our culture, our thoughts, our ideas, our religious differences, the countries that we came from. Those are all a huge part of the state of California, which in many ways is a mini version of what's happening within the entire United States. I've created circle groups that allowed us to share our stories of success, such as I think my best accomplishment for the year was, I don't care what it is, whatever you think it is, that's what's important. And I've learned from them. I've created videos, celebrate, you fill in the blank, composed of employees, students, faculty, administrators, discovering the best of what is happening on our campus and our multi-college district. We've used the videos to open convocation, put online, many ways that you can use videos today. We've held retreats ranging in size from 8 up to 184 people. We've called them barnstorming solutions. Imagine adult education in North Central California, a day together, transitional journey of how to identify the strengths and the collaboration that we were going to use. We've held elephant dialogues. When you do things like this, people are always saying, well, you're not talking about the elephant in the room. So we bring people together, say, all right, let's draw this elephant. What does it look like? What needs to be addressed? And very often, it is some kind of a technical thing that they want to have done that they felt was not done. I facilitated a number of summits in which ranged in size from 42 to 182. Imagine Vista College provide the groundwork and planning to change its name to Berkeley City College and to move from temporary facilities into a new single-building urban campus. And I believe we're going to have to do a number of these things as we move forward. Scott talked about, how am I doing? All right, I'm going to close up here. Anyway, imagine what it is we want in the future, and those are the kinds of things that we need to talk about. In closing, I just want to say that it is important for us to respect each other, to realize that what we do is about the power of story. Sometimes it's the sharing of my story, and sometimes it's about listening to others. But it's always about learning to weave our stories together in order to inspire. As A.L. Kitzelman said, the words I am are potent words. Be careful what you hitch them to. The thing you're claiming has a way of reaching back and claiming you. I am very excited about the future, and I want to help create some of the answers to the things, of the questions we're asking here. Thank you. And now it's Gary Wheeler.
Good afternoon. My task is to talk a little bit about the future of accreditation, compliance, and the regulatory environment in higher ed. But first, let me confess that I'm often taken by the images of my childhood. And I'll give you 3 of them to keep in mind as I talk about the regulatory environment and accreditation. When I grew up in the 50s, I watched a lot of B movies, but particularly The Blob. So keep The Blob in mind. I went to sleep every night with a transistor radio tucked in my pillow. So think about popular music and its influence in our culture. And when I was left alone at home, I often had to fight off door-to-door salesmen. So think about evangelism and the role of sales in our culture as I talk about accreditation and the regulatory environment. What we've had over time is a kind of ossification of expectation, so that when accreditation began in this country in the 1890s, the intention was that voluntarily we would get together and talk with each other about what we were doing at our institutions, in our classes, trade jokes and stories. We would encourage each other as peers. That model grew into a kind of peer review system where we shared best practices, where we helped each other think through some of the thorny challenges as we went from a single baccalaureate degree, which was what most colleges had back in the 1890s when accreditation started, into all of the specialization that took place over the course of the 20th century. And then the one piece that Roger didn't mention about 1964 is the thing that changed everything else. It was the blob of regulation. In 1964, one of the things that gets put onto accreditation is a link to Title IV monies. That is, if you wanted federal financial aid, you needed to have someone be able to say that what you were buying had a good housekeeping seal of approval. And how do we do that? We do that by asking the colleges essentially to evaluate themselves. And if they pass on that with each other, we will give them access, keys to the kingdom of federal funding. The federal funding was such a small part of the overall funding for students at that time. I, like Roger mentioned, was a national defense loan baby. I mean, imagine that. Here's a guy going into art classes being funded by the national defense. I mean, that was really cool. But back to this blob notion. What happened with that blob is that it began to swallow everything in its path. It began to expand into a sense that somehow not only was that tail wagging the dog, but it was the entire animal. And so what we have today is a sense that our aspirations, our sense of self-respect, our quality assurance is guaranteed by the federal government, which is a kind of an amorphous thing, much like a blob. When I think about where this may be going, I think what ends up happening at the end of that movie, The Blob, Steve McQueen ends up blowing it up. To some extent, we've had those kinds of discussions nationally. How to blow up this regulatory environment. How do we get rid of it and replace it with something different? In the background, cue popular music. Music in popular culture is one of those threads that builds on our own aspirations, our daily excitements, our wants, our desires especially. What it does is it tries to make real for all of us the sugar candy of experience. In accreditation circles, what that tends to be are those pieces of evidence that says that in addition to meeting expectations, that the institution is still appealing to students. It's still appealing to employers. Now, I'm not a vocational person. I came through higher education as an accident completely. I was not expected to finish high school either. I was not expected to go to college. I was part of a cultural group, and it still is now, American Indians, the lowest achieving educational group in the country. That's me. I was not expected to go to the Union Institute either, by the way. I helped set up this doctoral program, and the individual who was chosen as our leader for that organization, Barb Stonewater, said, you know, you better put your money where your mouth is. You ought to be part of this program. And I said, no, I don't want to do that, except to try to be that one who helps to bring others into it. So I helped. I went through it. But I was not part of Union because of some great inner aspiration or desire. Much like many of our students. They're often drifting along, and somehow what's in that popular music of our institutions grabs them. And they begin repeating those little mantras, those phrases in their head. I need this. Let me come. And it begins to build an emotional swell that gets them there. I think that image of emotional swell bringing new demographics to our institutions continues today, and is probably the one thing that keeps me most optimistic, despite all the regulatory environment stuff. It's that we are bringing new people into higher education all the time because of the popular music of our organizational structures, our content, our delivery methods. I mentioned door-to-door sales earlier. One of the great innovations of higher education, American higher education, was a sense that almost anyone can sell you almost anything, including education. And so we have had a long history, as Dr. Pruitt mentioned, of for-profit education services, from barbershops and tattoo parlors to business schools that developed all over the place. Somebody has a new idea, they want to teach somebody else about it. That's always been there. What's been different is the blob of enabling somebody to get into Title IV. And that has then exploded, not just that blob in an awful way, but it has opened up those pearly gates of Title IV to large corporate entities to gain a lot of their revenue, specifically and only from Title IV monies. But anyway, that door-to-door sales notion, where we feel that we can go individually to people to talk to them about their learning, about their needs, is one of those major threads, much like popular music, that I think is misunderstood. And as we move into the future of how do we think about the regulatory environment, we're really thinking about how do we manage sales? How do we manage interrelationships? One of the things that both Dr. Pruitt and Dr. Miller mentioned was the importance of networking, of partnerships, of building consortial relationships. Well, part of this blowing up of the regulatory environment I see in the future is that we will have consortial relationships unlike anything we have now. They'll come into being for short periods and then dissolve. My vision of the future is very unlike that of Union celebrating 50 years, in that it came into being and now this bubble is still here. I see them as looser relationships that come into being and then go out, come into being and then go out. Because I think we're going to see, with the disaggregation of educational services, lots of pieces where people are aggregating student services, content delivery, content assurance, and pulling them together as credit-based programs. The challenge is going to be, how do we assure quality over time with those models, with those alternative deliveries? And that's why we have these other people behind me sitting down. They're the ones who are actually going to help build it. All of you are going to help build that quality assurance method. But I think the thing that we have to hold on to is peer review. Other countries are looking to the United States for their models. But what they have that we don't, and thankfully so, is they have ministries of education. They have professionalized the peer review kind of examination and quality assurance and gone away from the practitioner-driven model for quality assurance. We have that in this country, and I think we are going to fight long and hard to keep it. I think we will be successful, especially with the good people of Union and people like yourselves helping to do that. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Mark Schulman.
Thank you, Gary. It's always a risk to be last. You're not sure, especially when you're not sure what's going to happen before you. But I think there is some themes, and we'll try to figure them out. And I will follow the discipline of the group so that we do have time for some dialogue. Let me provide a context for my remarks today. My political persona would be called leftist, would be called left-wing, and I offer no apologies. I've certainly been involved with the alternative and non-traditional movement in higher education. I like to think of it in some ways as radical in the sense of being to the roots, which I think is one of the things that Union did back in '64, and I think it's one of the things we need for the future, to be radical about what we're doing. So I'm committed to higher education of that kind, and I'm also committed to the social justice project that is associated with those kinds of institutions. In the course of our celebration this weekend, I want to acknowledge the role of Union in making me who I am. The points I make today are tied inextricably to my desire to live a life full of integrity. And as I navigated the churning waters of our sector for the last 4 decades. 30 years ago, 1985, when I graduated, I often remind myself my few years at Union provided a boost to my personal admonition, which is provided to me by Lillian Hellman in her letter to HUAC in 1952, where she so adroitly stated, "I cannot and will not cut my conscience to fit this year's fashions." Very important, I think. A brief personal digression that might also give you a little bit more of who I am and why I'm saying the things I'm saying today. One of my grandest moments was during my interview for the Antioch Southern California presidency. I was able to end the session with the search committee by referring to my student days at Antioch College back in the 60s, and I told them, in conclusion, it would be great to be able to have a position with the university sitting in the president's office, because in my prior incarnation, I was more often sitting in at the president's office. They gave me the job. And actually, it's not as surprising as it might seem, because that's the beauty of the kind of integration of personal and political and career and life that I've striven for, and I think institutions, certainly Union is one of them, should strive for. On the basis of my eclectic career as a faculty member and departmental administrator and my last 20 years as the CEO and Chief Academic Officer, CAO, sometimes both at the same time, of the institutions that you've seen mentioned in my bio. I'd like to offer 5 things I'm pretty sure are true. In the spirit of Goldie Blumenstick, who wrote an opinion piece for the Chronicle of Higher Education, I'd recommend that to you if you haven't seen it. And she said, as a reporter, 5 things that surprised me most. And she was referring to a new book that she'd written. And I want to mention those 5 things only because I think that someone who's studied higher education for 25 years and is an exceptional reporter as she is deserves to be mentioned here. She said these 5 things. Obviously, she added something to it. 1, higher education has become highly stratified. 2, the many hidden costs of intercollegiate athletics often go unscrutinized. That's not something we mentioned, but that might be a topic on someone's mind in the room. Higher education data are often lacking. I think we also can understand that. And her last 2 are interesting. All is not lost. That potential is fragile. So I think that is consistent with what we've said. Her new book just came out about 3 or 4 days ago, actually. It's called American Higher Education in Crisis, ? What Everyone Needs to Know. And it's published by Oxford University Press. I'd recommend it to you. It consists of 75 or so questions as a primer of where we are and where we're moving into. So I'm struck by the use of the word crisis, and I think we should try to understand that and unpack that a little. My 5 things may sound brash or intemperate. My intention, however, is to be a provocateur in the best sense of that word, and I'm hoping to avoid hubris by stating I'm pretty sure, not certain. Keep in mind that where I'm coming from would be what some would call the margins of higher education industry. That kind of designation doesn't bother me, as I think one of our tasks in that area is to adjust the margins, and I think it's demonstrable that we've done that pretty well. How many institutions call themselves transformative these days, by the way? Have you ever been struck by that? And Union, I think, is a shining exemplar about that. So here are the 5 things. I'm just going to mention them briefly. Number 1, crisis. What crisis? Or welcome to my world. Now, you know a little bit probably enough about me to know that the issues that have been mentioned here about accreditation, the days when places like Saybrook and Goddard didn't want accreditation and all of the realities of that are part of what are going on now. And of course, money. Don't have to mention money. It's always about having enough money to do what you want to do. Someone once said, vision without resources is hallucination. I remember those hallucinations. So you've got the realities of an entire industry facing some of the things that in my career I've seen at the institutions I've been at for a long time. So that's actually not a bad thing, and it's not a bad thing to think of it as a crisis in the sense of some of the other things I'm pretty sure about. Number 2, as Pogo said so eloquently, we have met the enemy and he is us. Or, thanks for the wake-up call, haters. Now, there are not actually haters out there a lot, but there are a lot of people who have a lot of negative things to say about our industry, right? And I'm glad they're saying it. I'm glad it's getting out there. I'm glad that their perception is they're speaking truth to power. I think they're actually the power and need to have truth spoken to them. But that's what they perceive in the way higher education is. And remember, the segment of higher education where the power lies is a very small portion of it. It's the elite institutions, which are part of the package, but not the whole package. Number 3, beware the hyper-hype techno-fix. I'll say that again, the hyper-hype techno-fix. Or, I'm looking at you, MOOCs. Now, interestingly enough, just since we've been thinking about MOOCs, as some of us have for a few years, institutions where I work have always had online programs and blended programs, so we've been interested in MOOCs. They're disappearing they're sinking below the horizon like the sun setting. That is not a bad thing. We'll see what they really mean. But I'll just remind you of a couple other things. In the recent past, we could go back in technology for a long time when people said the book was going to end the possibility of having the spoken word, but that's not something we'll get into too deeply today. But I will mention Second Life. You remember that? Second Life was that virtual reality that was going to change everything we do. We were going to have our campuses in Second Life. It's still around, I discovered when I Googled it recently. But it certainly didn't make the transformation it was supposed to. And the other one I'll mention to you is the Segway. I happened in coming in last night to see 25 people on Segways, which is the most Segways I've ever seen in my entire life on the streets of Cincinnati. What is it with you all? I don't know what you're doing, but whatever it was, the segue, if you recall, was they had all those people hyping it, saying it was going to change personal transportation, change the world, destroy the automobile. So we're at a point where, I mean, I can mention two that are coming along. Oculus VR, which is the new manifestation of virtual reality that you might have heard about, and Google Glass. So the realities of what goes on with this technical hype, we have to be very cautious about, it seems to me. Fourth, if we have to be in a culture war, let's win it. Or, yes means yes. I don't even like that phrase, culture war, but the fact is that we're in a pretty big mess in the world these days, and there's a lot of barbaric things going on in this country and the rest of the world, done by lots of different people against other kinds of people. None of those things that we've talked about since '64 and before have been resolved. And in fact, we have to be in the forefront, the institutions that care about these things, of really trying to get these issues to be part of the agenda in the proper way. I say yes means yes because some of you may remember back in 1992, 93, Antioch College passed a sexual policy on it was related to rape, and it was called the sexual offense policy. And if you remember at the time, it was ridiculed, it was scorned, it was abused, it was treated with great derision. It was a joke on Saturday Night Live, which is the ultimate kind of making a derisive comment, right? What's happening now? People are recognizing all these years later that sexual assault is a real problem, that rape is a real issue, that yes has to mean yes. And even in the state of California, as you've probably heard, there's now a policy that's been passed about affirmative consent. So I think we should stay out ahead of the curve on those things. Number 5, don't destroy the village in order to save it. Or as George said, don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. We are going to face all of these issues that are part of what's going on in higher education. I'm very interested in Scott's commentaries about what might happen, and I think a lot of the things he said have a good chance of happening. I don't know what's going to happen, but I think on these issues like affirmative action and shared governance and regulation and accreditation, all of the issues that have been mentioned, we really should keep our eye on the prize. Of course, it goes without saying that what I've just suggested is a personal take on the matters at hand. I believe that, though I've lived in the space of a small section of the industry, these 5 things have more universal applicability than just for small, non-traditional colleges. Even though these are difficult times, I confess that I have taken this opportunity to draft a love letter to the contentious, feisty, and immensely satisfying institutions with which I'm engaged throughout my career, and that most definitely includes Union. I'm reminded in my desire to encourage profound social change as a life's work that, as Che Guevara said, at the risk of seeming ridiculous, let me say that the true revolutionary is guided by a great feeling of love. Thank you for giving me permission to express that feeling today. I guess it's back to George.
Well, thank you, and thank you all. You've had your lunch. You've had a chance to rest while we did all of the work. Now it's your turn. We really do want to, we're glad that we were able to get the time to have your engagement, and we're going to try to do that for about 25, 30 minutes, and then 20 minutes. All right, we just lost 10 minutes, and then we're going to let Roger close. We really would like to hear questions or comments from the audience. Thank you.
Thank you. Can you talk a little bit about examples, either from your own institutions or other examples outside your institutions that you know about, of really successful collaborations with business or industry?
Is that on? I don't know if I'm going to give you a successful example, but I'm going to give you an example because it really did have a lot to do with my last presidency at Saybrook University, which is in San Francisco, now in Oakland, actually moved to Oakland in August. There is a group called the TCS Education System, and it started with 3 colleges all around the country that are all oriented toward adult education, professional education, graduate education. And it created a system that's called TCS, into which all of these 5 institutions now, Saybrook is was the 5th organization to join, are affiliated. Now, in one sense, it's simply a shared services model. There are offices in Chicago filled with people that are doing the work that we couldn't do as Saybrook as a small university, and we pay far less for that than we would have paid for doing that ourselves. But the idea, part of my role this year is actually to work on strategy initiatives for the system to figure out how interdependent and autonomous, because we still retain our separate 50c3 status of all the 5 institutions, can try to continue to work together and make the changes that we feel are necessary within the business model. That is, I think your question is extremely appropriate because it is about what business models are going to work in the next 10 or 50 years.
I'll mention a couple of examples. At my last institution, we were in a very rural environment, but there were 2 primary things that we needed to do. One was to deal with the water quality issues of agriculture and the use of a lot of materials that would be sprayed on plants and concerned about soil quality. And the other was on industries that used a great deal of water, like paper plants, and then would treat it in some way and put it back into the ground. And so what we ended up doing is working with both of those categories of industry and agriculture to develop a water quality monitoring program so that we would not only do some of the actual collection, but the analysis and interpretation as well for them, so that we were a neutral third party. So that's one example. Another example is with a large company like Micron Technologies in Boise, Idaho, where they're in the semiconductor industry, but they're also interested in what's the future of the supercomputer, of technology. And so they are seeding programs on the research side quite a lot with about 7 major research universities to try to imagine what those things might be, where it might go. So it's both on the pure research side as well as the more practical side, as I mentioned from my own college with the water systems.
Judy, did you
Yes, we have apprenticeship programs which we've worked with in the community colleges that are connected to labor unions, and they work to get the students into positions once they've completed the apprenticeship programs. We also have workforce development money from the federal government, and I don't know if that goes to, if some of the 4-year colleges also get that, but the workforce development money spread out of the federal government has helped make partnerships. And then at my most recent college in Woodland, we worked with the Farm Bureau and the ag business people in the Central Valley of California, connecting our program to what they needed in startup areas, and then we're partnering with UC Davis and the ag program there so that we were building a pathway for students so you weren't at a dead end making $40,000 or $50,000 a year, but you were never going to get beyond that. So those are the 3 things that we've done in terms of workforce and business.
Yeah, Thomas Edison's done a lot of this kind of stuff, but there's one I want to briefly talk about. And this started, it's been a while now, but the military decided that it wanted to change its incentive system. The biggest item in the defense budget is not hardware, it's training. And the incentive systems are to get students out. If you listen to the ads, look at all the wonderful things that will happen once you leave the military. And so the Pentagon kind of figured out that's really self-defeating. We need to figure out ways to incentivize people to stay in the military. And so they brought together a group of about 15 colleges. Thomas Edison was one of them. This is some time ago. To see if they could figure out a way to allow people that are on active duty service to work on their degrees while they were in the service. And of course, they move around a lot. There are a lot of challenges to that. And these 15 institutions were the original pilot to figure out if you could do that. And the answer was yes, you could do that. And now it's A lot of colleges and universities are involved in the military. But in the height of the deployment of the Gulf War, Thomas Edison had 4,000 students in theater in Iraq, Afghanistan, and ships in the Gulf. We even created some technology to allow a student that didn't have internet access, literally in a cave in Afghanistan, to study your accounting if you wanted to. Today we have 6,000 active duty military still enrolled in the college. In the Navy college program, we have the highest course completion rate of any college or university in the country. That program is being scaled back because of the drawdown in force reductions that are taking place. But it's also being scaled back because the withdrawal of funds support and the regulations that are now coming into the program make it prohibitive. Many of the traditional colleges and universities like ours are pulling back because the military is concerned that the proprietaries now have taken over that sector, and there is concern about public resources going to the proprietaries without regard to the work they're doing. There are some very good proprietary schools that are in that space doing work, and I'm afraid we're going to pull back and leave that sector behind, which would be sad. Other questions? Yes.
I wanted to direct my question to Dr. Miller. First of all of you were brilliant. Thank you for your comments. There was something you said that's really, really struck out to me, and it was the statement that, and I don't recall who said it, and I'd like to know, that today, given everything, we are 3 million people short of the number of people graduating from college a year or something like that. Did you say something like that?
I didn't use that figure, no.
No, that's mine. Don't be giving Miller credit for my stuff. The figure is there's a
What I was wondering is, to me, that point really needs to be all we ever hear, because to me it reeks of all the consequences, the dire consequences of that trend if it should continue for our nation. So thank you.
Yeah, that was I think his name was Anthony Carnival, but he's a very distinguished labor economist. He does a lot of the basic research labor statistics that you'll hear. That was his data that said if you looked at the needs of the current workforce today, not 15, 20 years from now, there is a 3 million person deficit between the requirements of the current workforce and what higher education is producing today. A couple of other figures that I didn't mention, which ought to be sobering. Last year was the first year since the end of World War II that the total enrollment in higher education has actually gone down in absolute numbers. Year before last was the first year. Last year was the second year. For 2 years in a row, total participation in American higher education in this country, for the first time since World War II, is declining. At the same time, the gap between what the current economy requires and what the academy is producing is increasing. And that's just to stay where we are, which has gone from number 1 in the world to number 17 in the world. Meanwhile, the countries that we are competing with, are in the middle of a huge, significant investment in research, development, and higher education. It's not a good place for us to be. There's a question right here, and then over here. Here and then over here.
Dr. Wheeler, my experience has been that regulation and compliance arise because of a need for quality assurance and combating abuse. If the biggest impediment to innovation is this regulation and compliance blob, then have you considered going to the powers that be and suggesting a blueprint for limiting abuse and assuring quality education without stifling innovation? In other words, perhaps changing the nature of the blob rather than having to blow it up.
The answer is, it's an obvious answer. The question is yes. Probably everyone around this table has spent a lot of time trying to rationalize the system. And there have been abuses. I mean, be really clear. There are bad actors in every sector. There are bottom feeders in every sector, and we have a collective responsibility to addressing that. If you go back into the 90s, remember the guaranteed student loan meltdown problem? That stimulated a huge response, regulatory response, that we're still living with today, and it hasn't been good. But 90% of the guaranteed student loan default abuses that occurred during that period were perpetrated by 3% of the institutions in higher education. Yet the regulatory response we've had has affected 100% of the institutions. The problem is marrying accountability, thoughtful, reasonable accountability with regulation that all of us would say. All of us believe in accountability. And sometimes our critics say we don't believe in accountability. It's not true. We oppose irrational, nonsensical, crazy, intellectually dishonest accountability that's imposed by good people. When you go and talk to the regulators, they're not bad people, and I don't want to vilify them. They're trying to respond to a problem. But the problem with the regulatory culture is they view that we're the problem and they need to fix us. Whereas there used to be a genuine collaboration between the regulators and the higher ed community so that we could get thoughtful collaboration. There's a thing called negotiated rulemaking. And it's kind of get down into the weeds, but basically the way the process is, before the Department of Education, for example, the one I know most about, they would announce that we're considering regulations for this area, and they would bring people in from the community to talk about what the rules were, and they would actually negotiate it. And if they could agree on the rule, then they would promulgate that. Sometimes some of the critics of that said you're negotiating with the people that you should be regulating, and that's not right. But what the good side of that was that it helped the regulators understand the consequences of the regulation from people that were in the field. In this administration, we haven't had a single successful negotiated rulemaking because the regulators have not listened to us. And the regulations, at least my personal frustration, there are two problems. One, there are issues of federal role. We're all dealing with a thing now called the credit hour. The Department of Education, in its wisdom, decided that there needs to be a federal definition of a credit hour that's tied to seat time in a classroom. First of all, you could make the argument that it's really not the federal government's role to define how a college or university defines a seat time, a credit hour. But even if you say, well, let the federal government do that, they came up with a definition that is idiotic, probably the worst definition that they could come with. And so now the people in the accrediting community, because the accreditors are required to enforce federal regulation, are now trying to figure out how to work with a college and university. We have all of the stuff. I don't know how this institution would deal with that. There are no seat times. There are no classrooms. How do you deal with residency programs and internships and all of the interesting blended courses and tie that to a classroom seat time? That's what I mean about the nonsensical, just ridiculous nature. We're fighting a thing called state authorization because they're mad at online courses. The future, in many ways, is going to be supported by different ways to apply the technology in different patterns and modes. So the federal government has come up with a rule that says, if a student is taking a course, the school that the student is taking the course from has to be licensed by the state where the student is. So we're in Cincinnati. We're on a border. We're on the border with Kentucky. So if you've got a student that's going to Northern Kentucky University, which is a school I know well, it's a very good school, and they live in Cincinnati, and they decide to take an online course from Northern Kentucky where they're a student, Northern Kentucky would have to be licensed by the state of Ohio. They took one course. If a congressperson from Ohio wants an intern from Ohio State and goes to Washington and he wants to take a course from Ohio State while they were in Washington, Ohio State would have to get a license by the District of Columbia. Or if you had three interns and one of them lived in Maryland, one of them lived in Maryland, one of them lived in the district, Ohio State would have to get a license in all three of them. That's the kind of bizarre, irrational, and the last one we're dealing with now is the federal government has decided that it, in its infinite wisdom, is going to take the role of U.S. News and World Report, and now it wants to start rating colleges and universities. I can't go into, so these rules aren't just nuisance. We all have to deal with federal rules that are paid in the rear end, and they're the course of doing business. You had to do with it. No one has ever seen a regulatory regimen like this. This is so far out of the pale that anything has ever happened before, and these things are destructive. Western Governors University that did a 50-state licensure review, they spent over $1 million a year in compliance. That's $1 million a year to increase tuition, just to cover compliance costs with no benefit. And it still doesn't do anything to fix the bad actors. The irony is, and I'm not a basher of proprietary schools, although there have been some abuses, but the irony is the schools that the feds are mad at and are trying to get at with these rules are already licensed in every state in which they do business. Not only are they, so it not only does not affect them because their businesses, the compliance costs, are business costs, which is tax deductible. So that's what I meant. That's the crazy, irrational environment. But the reasonable solution is, why don't reasonable people sit down around the table? And that's been the part of the frustration that you hear all of us emoting. We have all been attempting to do that without effect. Sorry, you got a question?
The presentations were excellent, and I have nothing more to say about it, but I have to make one minor correction so people don't go away with remembering what the end of the blob was in the film. It is not blowing up. It is frozen and dropped off in the Arctic.
That's a question here.
Hi, I'd like to say the speeches were great, and how can I obtain a copy of each speech? Is it possible?
Oh, I think Roger said Roger said it's being videotaped.
Okay.
I don't think any of us have, I think Scott may have had prepared remarks. I don't think any of us kind of wrote this stuff, and I'm still nervous about being videotaped. But
all right, thanks.
Till December the 1st. There was another, I saw another hand up, I thought. This one right here, here, and then here.
Yes, thank you for the fine remarks. Thank you. Given where all of you sit with your vantage on this landscape of changing and changed higher education, as well as your intimate knowledge of this institution, I was wondering if anyone would speak to the kinds of initiatives that Union Institute and University could undertake to try to leverage its rich history, the experiences it's had to lead going forward in this climate where we see the increase of non-traditional delivery systems, as well as creativity about blending online face-to-face. I think even in moments where Union has faced challenges, there's really been a lot of wisdom and lessons learned that seem to be sort of ahead of a lot of the mainstream edge here. So,
well, the president is going to close this, and I'm going to leave that one to him to talk about the union's role. But I will make a comment that we shared in our private conversation. We all of us reflected that one of the wonderful things about this institution was that it was not, and I'm probably going to get myself in trouble here again, but we all like to believe that we are student-centered institutions. This is not a criticism, it's an observation. The fact of the matter is most colleges and universities are not. They are practitioner-centered organizations. They are essentially built around the aspirations and ambitions and talents of the faculty. And so one of the challenges that all of higher education faces is balancing the aspirations of the faculty with the needs of the society. And I have no criticism of anthropologists, but if you got 15 or 20 great anthropologists in a room, they'd probably say that what American higher education really needs is a great doctoral program in anthropology. What this institution did was it didn't respond to an institutional need. In fact, there really wasn't an institution. This institution came together because it saw a societal need. It saw a need to reform and improve and make better American higher education. It was externally referenced, not internally focused. And what we have speculated about in our meetings is, how does an institution stay innovative, to stay creative, to fill what's needed, as opposed to becoming self-serving? What's the innovation? What's the day's innovation? What should that look like instead of the innovation that took place 50 years ago? And it is an inextricable law of organizations that if you create any organization, it will immediately justify its own existence and expansion and begin to serve itself and its own survival and its own aspirations and ambitions. I think our message has been, and Roger's been a part of that dialogue, is that we hope the union doesn't do that. We hope the union periodically reflects on what does our country need, what does our nation need, and what can the unique history and attributes of this institution bring to the table in a way that other colleges and universities can't or won't. And how do you find the next evolution and this institution has that background and should be free to do that. I must tell you, as president of a, quote, innovative institution that was created a little bit later in '71, I'm a cheerleader for Empire State College in New York. I think it's a wonderful school. We consider it sort of a sister institution across the river. And I did an accreditation visit. And it's a public institution, that stuff's public. And I kind of laughed because one of the struggles, and it's a wonderful school, so this is in no way a criticism. They do very high quality work. But it's staffed and led by people like us, of our generation, that they created something important, but they fell in love with it. And the challenge is, how do you not fall in love with your creation? Because if you fall in love with it, you want to keep it and protect it, even when you need to change it. And that's part of this challenge that Empire is dealing with. So the challenge to the union is, how do you not fall in love with the wonderful 50-year past? And it deserves to be loved and celebrated. But one of the things that's a constant is change and evolution. And so how do you lead it instead of how do you be managed by it? And that's always going to be the challenge of an institution that sees as a part of its mission innovation. I want to thank our president. He's a wonderful president. He's a wonderful friend. Thank you for bringing us together. I want to thank our panelists. It's good to see you again, many of whom I know, and it's wonderful to have sort of a reunion again. I want to thank you for your attention to us, and I'm going to turn it over to our president for his closing remarks. Thank you.
Well, I too want to thank our panelists. It was a pleasure to work with them in preparing these presentations. They've been very thoughtful. We've had lots of discussions. Obviously, it was a broad topic, and I commend them on taking about 10 minutes in order to cover. Having worked with a lot of presidents, I don't know if you realize how difficult it is to have a president talk 10 minutes, but it's amazing. You guys did a very great job, so thank you. And I'm very proud to serve as president of Union Institute University, which has produced graduates of this quality, and they truly are national leaders. And there are about 20 of these folks who have floated around the world in the last 50 years, providing leadership to some very innovative and creative institutions. And we couldn't do what we do each day without the support of our trustees. And we do have 3 trustees, and there may be more here, but at least I see 3. We've got Don Feldman, who's the chair of our board of trustees. We have Dr. Dick Aff, and we have Dr. Gladys Hankins. So thank you all for your support and your encouragement. Also, Dr. Felice Noodleman will be our commencement speaker tomorrow afternoon for our 50th anniversary. And Felice is the president of Antioch University, the chancellor of Antioch University. And she's also had quite a career with the New York Times and created the educational knowledge network there in bringing media together with higher education. Her presentation will be quite interesting. I've talked to her in Yellow Springs last week, and I'm looking forward to those comments. And Chris, in answering your question, I think it's a difficult role to be an innovative, creative institution and to walk a fine path. A friend of mine wrote an article many years ago talked about existing on the periphery of higher education. And yet I think it's a pretty good place to exist because it's generally on the periphery where exciting things happen and something transforms an institution which then can transform higher education. And I think we've been doing that for a long time. This university was created in 1964 for two reasons. One, to provide an alternative approach to higher education for adult learners. We are continuing to do that, and I think we're doing a very good job. And secondly was to inform the field, what we learned in the process. Forums like this help inform the field about what we've learned about higher education and how we can continue to change higher education. I think it's important for those of us who have the privilege of working at Union to be actively engaged in the field, to accept speaking engagements, to work with our congressmen, and to work with collaboratives in our local communities, whether it's in Florida, California, or here in Cincinnati. And we're reaching out, and we're trying to tell the Union story, but not just for Union's sake. It's to take the lessons that we have learned as a result of practicing a philosophy that emanated out of some brilliant people and brilliant minds in the 1960s and to apply those lessons learned to higher education. We've got to attract high-quality faculty who indeed embrace change as a reality of every day. One of the things that's so interesting about all of us who represent alternative education, at some point in our careers, we have individuals who either provided the leadership from an administrative point of view or from the academy who became almost moribund, and they became so defensive of the product and the system that they didn't allow it to change. We can't allow that in the 21st century for Union Institute and University. And so it's important for whether you're in an administrative role, whether you're in a support role, a staff role, a faculty role, it's important for us all to communicate and work together as a team. And if you talk to most, we've got some corporate executives here today. If you talk to corporate executives, they'll tell you that the successful institutions in the business world are going to be those that are very agile, they're very flexible, they're looking at a diverse workforce and how to respond to diverse customers and a diverse society. They're looking at how to celebrate employees and almost become employee-centric and looking at different work styles and different work environments and how do we tap into the creative genius of every individual. And then we're looking at collaboration. And I will tell you, of all of those things I've listed, in my experience in higher ed, higher education institutions have not been terribly collaborative. It's very difficult to work across those campuses and those territories. I think we've got to do a better job of collaborating and talking seriously about how we can support one another in keeping our focus on our students. As George and others pointed out, what is important, how can we educate the American people to really be good stewards of our civilization in a global society? And I think, Will and Ariel Durant I'm a historian, but Will and Ariel Durant wrote a book, wrote a 13-volume series on the story of civilization. And in that very first volume, they quote, talking about ancient Samaria, they said the same wealth that generates a civilization announces its decay. Well, if you think about it, we could say that same thing about money and higher education. We've all had access to federal dollars, the U.S. Treasury, whether you're a for-profit university or whether a not-for-profit. And to some extent, I think we've lost our vision and in some cases maybe lost our value, and we're looking for ways to get the money and to increase enrollments. But there's got to be more than that. It's got to be more than just enrollments and a sound budget. I love to have surpluses rather than deficits, don't get me wrong. I love that. But we've got to focus on what products are we producing that will help our students be competitive and be really change agents in a very difficult world. And we are facing pretty serious challenges around the world today. I think there are probably more conflicts now than there have been in the last 20 or 25 years. It's pretty amazing. But I do want to thank our panelists this afternoon. You all did a great job. And certainly there are many ways to give back to a university, but there's nothing better than giving your intelligence, your energy, and your talents and your intellect, and I appreciate your doing that for us today. Thank you all for attending. It's a pleasure to have you here, and I hope to see you tomorrow. Thank you. Thanks, Roger. Appreciate it. Gary?
gonna do.